We are back, and we are joined now by Orly Noy, editor of the Hebrew language magazine Local Call, chair of the executive board of B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, a journalist who writes for 972 magazine. Orly, thank you so much for coming on amid these undoubtedly hectic, scary times. I know you're calling from Jerusalem. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, given the fact that you're in Jerusalem, if you could just tell us what are the conditions on the ground as you see them, and what updates can you give us?
Well, specifically here in Jerusalem, it is probably the calmest city in the country right now, while the crisis in the south is still continuing, and there are still battles with Hamas members, and the north is being threatened by missiles from the direction of Lebanon. Jerusalem is more or less quiet, although we also had several sirens rushing us into shelters, and there have been missiles shot at the proximity of Jerusalem, but not in the city itself. But the general feeling and the general situation in the entire Israel is one of war. I mean, all the schools in the country are shut down. The university, the academic year, which was supposed to start this week, is being delayed. If you walk in the streets at any given city today in Israel, is completely empty. It's like ghost towns, all the cities, everywhere. And people, there's still a lot of chaos. A lot of people are still looking for their loved ones that are missing, and it's still unclear whether they have been abducted into Gaza Strip or dead already. Very little confirmed information is being provided by the government, which is just one of the many failures of this government since the beginning of this crisis Saturday morning.
Yeah, at the beginning of our program, we read a bit of the Haaretz editorial board's essential condemnation of Netanyahu and blaming the bloodshed here on Netanyahu's failure as a leader. I guess we can start there as well. He has announced a full blockade in Gaza, which means no electricity, no food, no fuel. And he has also announced his intentions to basically establish an emergency government in Israel. What is the status of that, and what does that mean?
So the two things that you just mentioned are the only two things apparently that Netanyahu knows how to do best. One is to continue punishing the Palestinian civilians of Gaza Strip, to take revenge, to shed more blood, and the other thing is try to save his own political skin. Those are basically the two things Netanyahu does best. Regarding the first one, it is really inconceivable that this government, that its intelligence could not fail to anticipate that deadly attack. And we are talking about the Israeli intelligence, which basically follows every breath that Palestinians take in both the West Bank and in Gaza Strip, couldn't anticipate that. It continued to very long hours in which citizens were left to fight basically for their own lives, being slaughtered, hiding inside closets, or being held as hostages by Hamas members without military or police troops coming to their help. And you know why is that? Because now we know that most of the army troops that were supposed to be posted and protect the southern border were relocated into the West Bank in order to protect settlers. So the citizens of the South were completely left unguarded for the sake of the settlers in the West Bank. And it continues on and on and on. But all of a sudden, what this government can do is to open the gates of hell once again upon Palestinians in Gaza. Really, it's unclear what this brutal criminal attack is supposed to achieve, except for calming the Israeli need for revenge right now. And I must tell you that the situation in Israel is incredibly, I mean, it's unprecedented, the amount of grief and sorrow and shock and also a desire for revenge. But this cannot be the political program of a government. Crimes cannot be a political crime, a political plan, and yet we see that happening. The other thing, expanding the coalition, is another. It's very common in Israel in times of crisis for the political Jewish scene to stand behind the leadership. Sometimes it ends up in expanding coalitions. But I think that this is just a temporary and short-term solution. In the long term, once that horrible, toxic dust will set down, the Israeli public is going to demand answers and accountability from the government generally, and specifically, personally, from Netanyahu himself. We just do not have a government right now. There is no state. Citizens are doing everything by themselves, collecting food, collecting aid, collecting supplies for the citizens in the south, providing transportation that is not being provided by the government. We just don't have a state right now.
I mean, and that is inexcusable, obviously, but it is clearly in keeping with, I think, a lot of what Netanyahu's tenure has been, as you delineated, which is a support for the settlements and the pogroms in the West Bank, with and kind of abdicating all other governing responsibilities here, including the fact that, I mean, has it been since 2014, if I'm mistaken, that the Israeli government has even spoken to and engaged with Palestinians in talks? Do I have that timeline right?
I don't. I mean, there was afterwards. I think it was afterwards. Netanyahu made some speeches, made the Bar Ilan speech, and etc. Presumably declaring his willingness or even desire to be once again engaged in talks or whatever. It didn't happen. And in fact, Netanyahu is constantly looking for bypasses to actually bypass the Palestinian issue through new alliances with the Gulf country, with Saudi Arabia now. And I think that this attack it cannot be detached from that political regional context as well. It was among other things, a way for the Palestinians to say, you cannot just forget about us and have diplomatic relationships with other Arab countries. We will not be forgotten. It was a very heinous, very cruel, very criminal way to do that. And there should be no, justification for those really heinous crimes that were committed by Hamas in the cities of Israel. But if we do not fully understand the context, we will not be able to get past that bleeding phase. And the context is both the regional, with the new ties with Saudi Arabia, but the context is also decades of oppression, of humiliation, of deprivation, of long, long years of siege over the Gaza Strip. You know, the UN pronounced Gaza to be unfit for human life years ago. Not only Israel, but also the international community didn't seem to be really, shocked or even concerned by those declarations. Uh, so we cannot, I mean, with all the grief and all the pain and all the shock and anger, we cannot just block out that entire context of decades of very, very cruel oppression.
Yeah, I mean, in my flurry of reading these statistics, the median age in the state of Palestine is under 20 years old. I mean, just give how young that population is, how many people have not seen outside of the walls, and then that gives you a sense of the health conditions and the amount of violence in the what has been described as an open air prison by countless human rights groups. And I just wanted to touch on as well a bit of what you mentioned earlier about the efforts at normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, also brokered by the United States via the Abraham Accords. How much in tandem with basically Netanyahu's green light for settlements and pogroms in Palestinian towns and villages, how much did that contribute to the sense of desperation that would empower a group like Hamas to commit these, obviously horrific acts of violence that you have condemned?
Yeah, so Netanyahu is very captivated with this idea of economic peace for many, many years now. That was the main idea behind the Abraham Accords. And now it's not purely economic, it's also strategic incentives concerning the relationship with Saudi Arabia. But first, it must be said that the Arab public opinion throughout the Middle East is in a very different place than its leaderships that are going along with those initiatives of Netanyahu for their own reasons. And in a way, those leaderships collaborating with Netanyahu's attempt, and it's not just Netanyahu, with the Israeli attempt, basically, to just put the Palestinians in a box, lock them away, and throw away the key, because we are paying less and less of a price for maintaining the long-lasting occupation and apartheid over the Palestinians. And I have no doubt that it played a factor in that horrible attack, driving Palestinians, and specifically Hamas, to shout out in a horrible manner what the world and Israel were not willing to hear when they said it with their words. We didn't need that horrifying reminder to know that the Palestinian case cannot be forgotten through those bypassing alliances with other Arab countries. The Palestinians deserve justice. They will continue to resist and fight for justice and for their freedom. But it's incredibly heartbreaking to see that very justified resistance taking such a criminal, unhuman, violent turn.
Yes, and yet, as you say, it is predictable in the sense of the feelings of desperation among Palestinians. Just to give our viewers a bit of a sense of what Hamas is and their relationship, what Hamas's relationship is to the over 2 million Palestinians. Many of whom have zero ability to express their voice in ways that are democratic, or in ways that will have, an effect that they can tangibly see to alleviate their immiseration. How does Hamas fit into that, and in terms of because there's a lot of condemnation of Hamas, obviously, in the wake of this, but just if you could give our viewers a rundown of what Hamas is.
Well, Hamas is a very big thing. I mean, it's not one thing. It is both a political party and leadership, which has also armed branches, several armed branches. So it's also a resistance group, and it's also an ultra religious Muslim group, and it's a political group that is present in the Palestinian parliament. By the way, all of the Palestinian parties, not only Hamas, are considered illegal and are designated as terrorist groups by Israel. So we should also keep that in mind, that Israel constantly limits the way of unarmed Palestinian resistance to the occupation in many ways. So the rising of Hamas since 2006 also had to do a lot with the very corrupted mechanism and leadership of Fatah, and people were fed up with that corruption that basically brought them nowhere. Since the very establishment of Hamas, Israel has been playing a sort of a double game. That on the one hand, it condemns Hamas as a terrorist group and punishes the citizens of Gaza for electing them, but at the same time, and these, by the way, are quotes from right-wing ministers, for example, Bezalel Smotrich, that said, that was quoted saying a while ago, we do not have an interest in eliminating Hamas because Hamas actually has an important role in weakening the Palestinian Authority led by Mahmoud Abbas, by Abu Mazen. So in that double game that Israel is playing, it actually made sure that Hamas doesn't go anywhere.
Yep.
And keeps, being a significant player just so it can be a counter power to Mahmoud Abbas's Palestinian Authority. So we see these days how well that turned out for Israel.
And I mean, it was very well said, and it also benefits their efforts to paint Palestinians as terrorists, and it also will justify the bombing of areas that are Hamas strongholds, essentially civilian infrastructure and apartment buildings and hospitals and schools, which Israel has done for decades at this point. I know we don't have you for a ton of time, so I just wanted to ask you a bit more, lastly, about what a ground invasion would really mean, because that is a threat that is looming right now, and the prospect of a ground invasion in Gaza, and how that actually would be as devastating as it sounds.
Uh, I am terrified by the idea of what is awaiting us in the days ahead of us. Uh, Ground invasion, I mean, not that, airstrikes are any less destructive or lethal, but ground invasion into Gaza would mean a whole different scenario. It's for some time now, after one of the last, I think it was after 2014, that basically everything, Gaza turned into a pile of ruins. And when they reconstructed Gaza, they made sure to build the buildings in a way that an Israeli tank can actually drive between them without tearing them down. But we are talking about the most densely populated place on earth. I heard somebody saying today, I heard Amy Goodman actually saying today that Hamas, that Gaza is more or less in the size of Detroit, just to give a sense to the American audience. And while in Detroit the population is about 600,000 or so, in Gaza is 2.4 million people. So you can imagine what a line of Israeli tanks driving basically on the constructions, flattening down what remained in Gaza after the Air Force bombings would mean, and what possibilities of rehabilitation, if any, would ever be possible again in Gaza.
Well, Orly Noy, really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for coming on. You can read Orly's work. I mean, I saw that you had a piece out in The Guardian today, but also at 972 Magazine, over at Local Call. Also chair of the executive board of B'Tselem. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it, and stay safe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.